Those who died became part of the final solution, a total of 6 million Jews who perished as a result of Hitler's policies. If those from the St. Louis survived the war, the concentration camps in the same proportion as did their fellows, then in France 180 would have lived out of 224 who went there. Only 60 out of 181. Most of 288 who went to Britain lived. What is certain is that if Cuba or the United States opened their doors, no one from the ship would have died. Well, we know that. I think 618 went back to the European continent, and of the 618, approximately a third survived. I have the actual numbers in my speech, but I don't have that information right in front of me. I know I took it right out of this book, but I can't find the exact page here.
I want to write down the name of that book because my wife's a book collector. I want to get it. You think if I go to Amazon or if she could find it in a bookstore?
Amazon.com has got them. I look on Amazon.com every so often, but you want to make sure that you get the Stein and Day, if you can find it. Get the Stein and Day edition.
I'm going to write that down. Maybe I should do it right now.
And try to get one with a dust cover, like this.
Yeah.
There are some other editions available.
Yeah, hold that up. Let's see if I can see it. Hold it.
You should be able to get one for less than $20 if you shop around on the internet. But there's some second editions and third editions, and then there's some newer editions, but published by Stein and Day.
Okay.
Most of them are the book club editions. I don't think it makes a whole lot of difference unless you're a collector. This one I got here, this is a book club edition. That's usually what's out there. Copyright 1974, Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witz, Stein and Day Publishers.
Okay.
See if I can remember my presentation. All right.
Your name. My name is Rudy.
Today my name is Dr. Rudy Jacobson, but it always hasn't been this, as you'll see as we go along. Originally, my name was Rudolph Cohen. I was born in a little farming community called Insterburg in East Prussia, Germany, a little enclave just to the east of the Baltic Sea, north of Poland and south of Lithuania that was left over after the First World War, called East Prussia, the capital of which was called Königsberg. And if you look at a map today, that name was changed to Kaliningrad, and Insterburg is now called Cherniakovich, thanks to the Russians. And that area after the Second World War was divided up after the Russians left between Lithuania to the north and Poland to the south. But the Russians kept a little strip between the Baltic and about 125 miles to the east, and they kept that, and they still call it Kaliningrad as the capital, the name of the capital city.
Do you know how that would be spelled?
K-A-L-I-N-G-R-A-D-E, I believe, or D. Maybe there's two N's in it.
Okay.
K-A-L-I-N-N-I-N-G-R-A-D-E. And my hometown is about 100 kilometers further east, which is about maybe 62 miles, 65 miles, and it is called Cherniakovich, but I couldn't tell you how to spell that.
Pronouncing it right.
And it's a, as I say, this this little enclave of Kaliningrad is about 160 miles east to west and about 75 miles north to south. And it's about 75 miles south and west of Kalinov, Lithuania. My biological father, Erwin Cohen, and my mother were divorced in late 1933, and then my mother remarried a gentleman by the name of Rudy Jacobson in, can we stop that a minute?
Yes.
About my mother and stepfather, my mother getting remarried.
Yeah, okay.
Ready?
Ready to roll.
Okay. Oh, my mother remarried in October 1934 and married a gentleman by the name of Rudy Jacobson, who was a buyer for women's ready-to-wear at a department store that was called Tietz in Bamberg, which was in Bavaria, about an hour's drive north of Nuremberg. And so in October 1974, my mother and I moved to Bamberg to be with her new husband. And I spent the next, from 1934 until 1939. So the next 5 years growing up in Bamberg. And my first real memories as a child were from that Bavarian city of Bamberg, and I can still recall my earliest recollections were when my Nanny and I were in a park watching a game of soccer being played between some of the girls that were the equivalent of the Girl Scouts, only I think in Germany they were called the Wandervogel, which was like the girl equivalent of the Hitler Youth. And they were having a soccer game in the park, and one of the girls got kicked or hurt pretty bad, and they had to call an ambulance, and this gray ambulance arrived, and I still remember seeing the ambulance pull up onto the grass, and they opened the rear door. It looked like what we typically see a hearse now, the old hearses where the back door opens up and the stretcher comes out, and they put her on the stretcher and wheeled her over there and put her in the back of this ambulance, closed the door, and it drove off. And that scene made such an impression in my mind that in future years, every time I saw one of those gray Navy, old Navy ambulances with the single door swing open, it brought that scene back. And I couldn't have been more than about 4 years old, 4.5 years old when that happened. Another real early recollection in my youth was when my parents and I were at a resort in Czechoslovakia called Marienbad, and we were sitting out on the balcony in the morning having breakfast. And in Europe, when you eat a soft-boiled egg, they bring it out in the shell, put it in a little egg cup, and then they knock the top off with a knife, and you spoon out the soft-boiled egg with a spoon. And I was eating my soft-boiled egg in that manner when apparently a piece of eggshell fell into the egg and got caught in my throat, and I started to gag, and for some reason or another couldn't breathe. And I remember my dad. Now, we have to clarify one thing. I have a father who was Eric, who was Erwin Cohen, who left the scene when He divorced my mother in late 1933. And then I have a stepdad, who I refer to as my dad, who is Rudy Jacobson, and he's the one who grabbed me and turned me upside down and started slapping my back. And, of course, I lost my breakfast and everything else that morning and embarrassed the family. And that is one thing that I remember clearly. My mother couldn't figure out how I could remember something like this because I was only about 3.5 or 4 years old. But when you can't breathe and you think you're going to die, it makes a pretty good impression on you. And so this happened in about late 1937 in Czechoslovakia. Those are two of my earliest memories. And I think I come to the conclusion that when it's a traumatic incident, like the girl getting hurt, me choking, it makes an impression very early on, and traumatic impressions make an impression on one's conscience and memory a lot sooner than nice impressions. That's my own psychological conclusion. So anyway, those are my earliest recollections when I was growing up in Bamberg. I also remember lots of Nazi soldiers marching up and down the street with their accompanying bands, one of them carrying what they called a vertical xylophone, which they called the glockenspiel, and they're playing these tunes, marching tunes. And of course kids love bands and parades, so whenever I was walking down the street with my nanny, and of course in those days you don't let a 3-year-old run around by himself, so I was always accompanied by a nanny or a babysitter or somebody, so I would always run up to the curb to see the soldiers marching, and that always made an impression on me, especially the shiny glockenspiel with the sun shining on it. Now so those are my early childhood memories, most of which are reasonably pleasant because I did not experience the discrimination and the effects of the Nazi Nuremberg laws and their effects on the Jewish population as it was intended.
So in school you didn't experience any anti-Semitism or at that time?
No. First of all, I never went to school. I was too young, and by the time I was old enough to go to school, Jews were not allowed in public schools, so I never attended school in Germany. And that's one of the reasons why when people say, you were from Germany, brought up in Germany, how come you don't have an accent? The reason I don't have an accent because I never went to school in Germany, and I never started forming my vowels and my German words in school, so I don't have any accent for that reason. So, but my parents, of course, being adults, they were subject to the Nuremberg laws, and they realized early on that because of the passage of these laws and the way things were going, that there was no future for them or for their family in Germany, and they decided it was time to leave Germany and emigrate to the United States. So they applied for a immigration quota number, which is something that you had to apply for in order to get a visa to come to the United States, because there were too many people who wanted visas, and because of the discrimination laws that were passed in early 1920s, you had to have a visa to come to the United States, but there were only a little over 27,000 visas issued to Germany and Austria for immigration to the United States, and there were over 100,000 applications in 1937 and 38, and so in order to be fair, they had to have quota numbers issued, so that when the quota number came up, then you were eligible to apply for a visa. But you would only get the visa if you had a sponsor, which meant that somebody had to vouch for you financially so that you would not become a ward of the state once you arrived. This meant that this person had to provide you with a job and with financial maintenance so that you would be able to take care of yourself and your family until you earned enough money to sustain yourself. And so they applied for their immigration quota number in 1935, hoping that they would be able to leave Germany before things got any worse. And I won't go into all the details about the Nuremberg laws, but they basically were there to harass the Jews and make life unbearable for them so that they would leave Germany. And at that time, of course, there was no final solution, and there were concentration camps, 3 of them set up to put in dissidents and people that disagreed with the Nazi party, and to lock up people that the Nazis felt needed retraining, and the opposition party people. But there wasn't any mass deportations or anything like this at this point in time. So anyhow, the people realized that that it was time to leave Germany. The younger people, I should say. People were of 2 opinions. My grandparents said, "Oh, this Hitler's just a blowhard. We've seen this before. Somebody's going to take a shot at this guy, get rid of him, and then things will get back to normal." And he told my mother and Dad that you young kids, you got the whole future ahead of you. You go ahead and take your family, go to America. We're too old. We can't start over again. I've got my business here, my friends here. Our family's lived here for over 400 years. We're staying. So my grandparents decided they weren't going to leave, and they're staying, and they paid for it with their lives. But my parents had the foresight to make arrangements to leave, and so they are the ones that applied for the quota number. Now,
were your grandparents real religious? Do you remember anything about that?
Well, at that particular time, Germany was kind of the forerunner of the reform movement, and there was quite a few Reformed Jews in Germany, and I would say that as far as my grandparents were concerned, I think my grandmother was fairly religious and kept a kosher house, and my grandfather, he was kind of lukewarm. There were some stories that I won't spend a whole lot of time about, but I would say that he was like most typical American families, where the man was busy earning a living and didn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about religion, and the woman took over that part of it. So I would say that they were moderately religious. I'm not real sure that my grandfather kept a kosher life outside the house. In any event, they decided that they were going to stay because they were just too old to start over coming to a new country. And an important event happened in May 8th of 1938. My mother and stepdad had a child, and so I wanted a brother, and he arrived 3 days before my 5th birthday as a birthday present. So now we had a baby. And this becomes significant as the story goes on. Toward the end of 1938, about a third of the Jews of Nazi Germany had left. But this was not fast enough or enough people to please the Nazis. and they decided they needed an excuse of some kind to let the remaining Jews know that they meant business, and they wanted the Jews to leave, and they wanted Germany, Judenrein, free of Jews. So they needed an excuse to turn up the pressure. And in end of October 1938, a fella in Paris by the name of Greenspan gave them the excuse they were looking for when he got a letter from his parents that they'd been deported back to Poland under some inhumane conditions on a very rainy night, and it upset him greatly the way they were treated, and he kind of lost his cool, got a hold of a pistol, walked into the German embassy in Paris, and shot a German official who at that time was a second under secretary of the embassy, who was a nobody, but that didn't matter. As far as the Germans were concerned, this person died, and they decided this was perfect for their propaganda purposes, and they decided to make a martyr. And so Goebbels got on the air, and he was told by Heydrich, the number 2 guy in the Gestapo, that he was to make an example out of this incident and let the Jews know in no uncertain circumstances that this was the last straw. And so Goebbels got on the air and started haranguing about this martyr of the Third Reich having been killed by this no-good, dirty Jew, and that he wants to go ahead and have all of the good German stormtroopers turn out for a memorial march on the night of November 9th, and they were going to march in honor of this martyr of the Third Reich. And so what started out as a memorial march through the Jew baiting and haranguing of Goebbels turned out into a program, as they used to call it, where the stormtroopers went ahead and started breaking the storefronts of the Jewish businesses, and they broke into Jewish homes, ransacked the Jewish homes, and ransacked Jewish synagogues, set fire to about 1,400 of them, and because of the broken glass, it was finally called the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. And so the final toll, of course, was about 1,400 synagogues were destroyed. Close to 100 Jewish men were beaten up that were found on the street. Many of them died. And the following day, I remember very clearly because they arrested all the Jewish men they could find between the ages of 16 and 65, including my dad. Now, I remember the night of November 9th very clearly because we were ready to sit down for dinner, and it must have been maybe about 6:30, 6:45, when I was ready to take my first spoonful of soup. A friend of the family came running in the door and yelling, "The synagogue's on fire, the synagogue's burning, the synagogue's on fire." My dad jumped up, grabbed a couple of jackets, and the two of us ran over to where the synagogue was. And I always thought it was a long distance away till my wife and I went back in 2002 and retraced the steps, and it turned out it was only like about a block and a half. But I guess when I was younger, my legs were shorter and it seemed like it was a longer distance. Anyhow, we ran over to the area where the synagogue was, and we stopped diagonally across the street, and we hid behind the house diagonally across the street, around the side of the house, near the side entrance where we couldn't be seen because we were around the corner of the house, and then I could sneak around the corner and look diagonally across the street, and we weren't more than about maybe 70 feet away, 75 feet away from the synagogue, and I could see across the street on the sidewalk the brown shirts running up and down the sidewalk throwing items, probably bricks or rocks, through the stained glass windows, and flames shooting out of these broken windows. And of course, this was November 9th. It was about 6:45, so it was already dark because of the time of the year. And when you see flames shooting out into the night like that, it makes quite an impression on a little guy like me. So I remember that very clearly. And we must have stood there for 10, 15 minutes watching the goings on, and then apparently snuck back home unobserved. And then the next morning, must have been around 10:30, 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and there was the regular policeman who I recognized, plus a guy in a black raincoat, and they want to know if Eric Jacobson was home. And when he came to the door, they said, "You have 10 minutes to pack a bag, you're under arrest, you're coming with us." And they took him off. There was no explanation as to why he was being arrested, what for, or anything else, but away he went. And he went down the street with a bunch of other men that were also being hauled off, all in the direction of the railroad station. And that's the last we saw my dad, and we had no idea where he was going. And then I was holding on to my mother's skirt, and she was holding her 6-month-old baby in her arms, because he was born previous May. And there she was, with the breadwinner being arrested, no idea how long he'd be gone or when she'd see him again. So the first thing she did was make arrangements to get rid of me and get me out of her hair, and she made arrangements to have me sent to her parents. And then she went to the Gestapo headquarters to find out why he was arrested and what she needed to do to get him released. And she was told that he was arrested for his own good because he was under protective custody since the night before. About 100 Jewish men were beat up, some of whom died, and they were afraid that this could be repeated again by these hooligans, and they were going to keep these men under protective custody for their own good, to make sure they're safe, and that if she wanted to see him again, she would have to make arrangements for us to leave Germany and show them proof that some other country was willing to take us by showing them a visa or landing permits for that country, as well as that we had obtained passage to get to that country. Well, then they suddenly realized that in order to get rid of these Jews, they're going to have to provide some kind of transportation. So they talked to their steamship line, the Hamburg America line, saying, you're going to have to make one of your ships available so we can get rid of these Jews. And so they offered up one of their finest cruise ships, the Hamburg, the St. Louis. And so my mother went to my mother decided that she was going to go to the Cuban embassy to try to get a visa. Because at that time in 1938, there were only 2 countries that allowed Jewish immigration: Shanghai, China, or Cuba. And since they had applied for the landing permits, she decided that once the landing permit, the quota number came up, that it'd be a lot better to be sitting in Havana, Cuba, 90 miles from the United States, than halfway around the world in Shanghai, China. So when she went to the Cuban embassy for a visa to Cuba, she was told that all the visas had been issued for 1939, or 1938, whatever year it was, and that the Cuban government realized there were a lot of people trying to get out of Germany, and that they had authorized the Immigration Department to issue landing permits. So she paid $500 to the Cuban Immigration Department for landing permits for our family. Then she went to the Hamburg America line to book passage on the St. Louis, and not only did she have to pay for the passage to Havana, but they also told her in order to get passage to Havana, she would have to buy half a return trip, because somebody's going to have to pay for an empty ship to get back to Germany. If everybody gets off in Havana, who's going to pay for the return trip? So all the people that had booked passage on the St. Louis had to pay for half a return trip. This was another way that the Germans were able to fleece more money out of the Jews, because they wanted to get every cent they could from these Jews before they left Germany. So now she had the landing permits to Havana, Cuba, and she also had booked passage on the St. Louis. She went back to the Gestapo headquarters. She showed them these documents, and they said, fine. Now, your husband will be released by the end of March, and with the understanding that you're going to leave the country within 90 days, never to return. And he was. So the end of March rolled around, and he was released, and then the preparations were made to pack up our household goods and make arrangements to meet the ship in Hamburg to leave. And another interesting item here is the packing. In those days, you had containers when you traveled across the ocean. It was like the containers nowadays, but they weren't made of metal like they are today. They were made, and if I remember correctly, it was like a plywood. So you had this big wooden box that was delivered to your house and dropped off in front of your house or in your driveway, just like ABF Trailers does nowadays if you're going to travel from one state to another here. They come and they drop the trailer off, you load it, they come pick it up with their semi, and then they take it away. And so prior to that, the day they deliver the big old plywood box, which was called a lift, L-I-F-T, you prepared all of your packing in boxes. Now, to make sure that you didn't take things out of the country that you weren't supposed to, because nothing of value was to leave Germany. If you had anything of value, it stayed with the state. If you had stocks and bonds, if you had savings accounts, if you had any kind of real estate, a business, the business had to be sold to a non-Jew, an Aryan. They knew you had to sell it, so you weren't going to get a lot for it. If you had real estate, you had to sell it. All the money, the proceeds had to go into your bank account. If you had life insurance, you had to go ahead and borrow the cash value. The cash value went into your banking account. Stocks and bonds had to be sold. Anything of value had to be turned into cash and put into the bank, and so on. Everything had to be turned into, all your assets had to be turned into cash, and that money had to be put into your bank account. Now, when it came to packing, you were not allowed to take anything out of value. Anything like silver, silver service, silver place settings, jewelry, furs, cameras, antiques, rare books, anything of value could not be taken, had to be surrendered. To make sure you didn't sneak something out like a diamond ring or a gold bracelet or something, when you pack up a box, one room was designated to store all the boxes until the lift arrived. In our case, it was the dining room. The dining room in this particular house had two tall doors, and each door had a big round handle. And so This house, I think, had about 9 or 10 foot ceilings. I just remember these tall doors were very tall. And so during the daytime, as these boxes were packed and brought into the dining room, there was a German official to inspect those boxes to make sure that nothing was in the box that was not allowed. And I have, each box had an inventory sheet. And I have I have about 8 of the original inventory sheets that I take around with me to schools and I display. And one in particular I keep under a piece of Mylar that I show because it's got about 8 red lines on it that are very visible. And these are items that were redlined by an official because he found 8 items in this one box that were contraband. And he took out and confiscated. Very ridiculously minute items like a small child's play setting that was silver plate or maybe sterling silver that he took out and confiscated. The total value was $3.70 mark, which was about less than $2. And then there was a child's bracelet, and there was a pair of silver sugar tongs. We're talking about little items that were worth less than $2, $3 that were confiscated because they were made of silver or they were made of gold plate or something. In any event, so I have that sheet of paper to show that these 8 items were confiscated because according to their criteria, it was contraband. Anyhow, after all the items in the house were packed up in these boxes, they were then put into the dining room where they were stacked up. Now, to make sure that you did not add a box at night when this official was gone with something in it that shouldn't be, when that official left, he closed the 2 doors, and then he took a wire and he ran this wire in a figure 8 loop between these 2 round door handles and put a lead seal on the ends of the wires and then took a pair of pliers and pinched that seal shut. So in other words, the doors were sealed shut. So you could not add anything to that room while he was gone. Now I just remember seeing the door with the wires and the little lead seal pinched on there. I don't know why that made such an impression on me, but in later years I keep thinking to myself, what if somebody wanted to sneak something in through the window? Because I know the dining room had windows, and I don't remember ever walking by the window to see what they did to seal the windows, but I'm sure if they went through all that trouble to close the door, they must have done something to seal the windows too. In any event, you couldn't carry a box in through the door. Maybe they figured you weren't going to bother trying to carry a box up in through the window because the window was fairly high off the ground. So, in any event, they wanted to make sure that you did not take anything out of the country of value. No Leica cameras or any kind of jewelry or anything like that. The only thing you were allowed to take out when you left was 10 mark per adult. I don't know if that included me or not, but 10 mark was about $4.70. So when my parents left, they each had $4.70 for shipboard expenses. All that cash that you got for selling your business, selling your real estate, selling your bonds, selling your stocks, stayed in your bank account. All you could take out was $4.70. The rest of that money stayed in the bank for the government. So when the Jews left Germany, they were practically penniless. So they ended up on the St. Louis with barely enough money to buy chewing gum, so to speak. Once all the boxes were packed, everything was ready to go, the lift arrived, was dropped off alongside the house, and then the movers came, moved all the furniture and everything into the lift, packed everything up, and then along came the big old truck. I imagine it was, I don't remember seeing how they did it, but I assume they just came with a big old lowboy, lifted that thing up with a crane, dropped it on there, and hauled it up to the harbor in Hamburg. And then we went up there. And I remember that we did board the ship a couple days before it sailed, because we celebrated my 6th birthday on board the ship. Because I got a little present of a ship model. I don't know if it was a model of the St. Louis, but I just remember it was a model, and it was made of blocks. And you put these blocks together, and when you put them all together, there was a ship. And I remember that on the stern, there was a flag you put in on the back end of the stern, and of course it was a swastika flag, since this was a German ship, which my dad promptly crushed up and threw in the wastebasket. I remember that. So I had this. This was my birthday present on my 6th birthday.
You still have it?
No. I don't know what happened to it. And so that was on May 11, 1933. And then 2 days later, May 13, 1933, the ship sailed for Havana, Cuba. And it took, from my understanding, it took about 14 days. And then when the ship arrived in Cuba, the captain was told, do not dock in your usual docking space. We want you to lay anchor in the harbor, because tomorrow morning the immigration officials want to come on board and check everybody's documents. And when they did, those people that had Cuban visas, and there were only 28, because remember I said all the Cuban visas had been issued, those 28 people were allowed to get off the ship. There was one tourist from Hungary.
Can you hold just a second? Okay.
All right. In addition to the 28 people who had the Cuban visas, there was also one tourist businessman on board. He was a 937th passenger. He was a Hungarian man. He also was allowed off the ship. So that meant 29 people were allowed off the ship. Now the remaining people were told that they're going to have to wait until they get their documentation all straightened out, because things were not quite in order. Which really meant they were stalling, because President Brew of Cuba found out that the Minister of Immigration had gotten $500 for the landing permits, but he didn't share the spoils with the president. So the president, being the mercenary that he was, decided if the Minister of Immigration could get $500 from each one of these rich Jews, he could too. So he decided that he was going to get another $500 from each one of these people before he would let them off the ship. So he let the Jewish agencies, such as the Hayas and the Jewish Federation and some of the other charitable organizations in New York, in Mexico City, Philadelphia, let them know that Cuba was a poor country just coming out of the Depression. They could not allow these 900 people off the ship and meld into the Cuban workforce, because they would take jobs away from Cuban citizens. And if they let them off the ship, they would have to intern them, which means they would have to house them and feed them. And if they stayed for a longer period of time, they might even have to clothe them. And this means that they would have to have $500 for each person they let into Cuba to defray these expenses. Well, that meant that they would have to have around $450,000 for the remaining 908 people. Well, this was an awful lot of money back in 1939. And so the Jewish agency said that we can raise the money, but it might take a little bit of time. So be patient with us. And he said, fine, get it as fast as you can. Well, after a week and no money, the people, of course, were getting a little bit irritable under the hot Cuban sun, not knowing what's going on. Their greatest fears were that if they weren't going to get into Cuba, they may have to go back to Europe. And a lot of the men on board had just gotten out of concentration camps with the understanding they weren't coming back. And so they wanted to get off their ship. And, of course, in many cases, the husbands were already in Cuba, the wives and the children were on the ship, or in some cases, the husbands were still on the ship, and they'd already sent the families ahead. So the families were split up. The people that were in Cuba had come out on some launches that they had rented, and they were surrounding the ship on these little boats, yelling up to the people that were on the ship, and it was a very untenable situation. And tempers were flaring, and the captain could see that there could be some problems. He could not talk to 900 plus people every day and let them know what's going on. So he decided, in the best interest of morale and safety, he would have to have a passenger committee. So he selected 5 learned men. I think there was 2 lawyers and 3 doctors. And he would meet with these people daily and let them know what's going on, and then they would go out among the passengers and disseminate information as to what's going on as far as negotiations are concerned, and try to keep the passengers calmed down. One of the things they decided was that they were going to send telegrams to President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Mackenzie King of Canada, the governments of Mexico, Chile, Argentina, some of the other Western democracies, to ask for asylum for these passengers in the event that they can't get into Cuba. And so far they hadn't heard back from anybody. So after about 6 days and no money, the president of Cuba decided he would increase a little bit of pressure on the charitable organizations, and he told Captain Schroeder of the St. Louis that the St. Louis is in the way of commerce, and he's going to have to move the ship out of the harbor because it's in the way. So reluctantly, the captain moved the ship out and started north, hoping that they would hear from Roosevelt by the time the ship got abreast of the United States. And in the meantime, they sent a second telegram pleading for asylum for these remaining 900 passengers because it doesn't look like Cuba's going to let them in, and they may be faced with returning to Germany. And since most of these passengers were holding quota numbers for the United States and would be entering the United States within the next 6 to 9 months anyway, couldn't they possibly let them in a few months early, and so on. Now, before the ship left Cuba, one passenger, I think he was an attorney, lost his cool, cut his wrists, and tried to commit suicide and jump overboard. A fellow by the name of Lowy. And he was picked up by the Cuban police, and he was taken into Havana to a hospital. So that meant that 30 people got off the ship and left 907 passengers remaining on board. So the ship left the harbor with 907 passengers, started heading up north toward the United States. And by the time they got abreast of Miami, they still hadn't heard anything from President Roosevelt, and his response was, they sent out a Coast Guard cutter to circle the ship to make sure that it would stay outside the 3-mile limit and that no one jumped overboard and tried to swim to shore. And then they also sent out a Coast Guard plane to make sure that the ship stayed in international water. That was the United States' reply to the plea for asylum. So then they continued further north, hoping that maybe Canada would let them in. And by the time they got halfway to New York, the Jewish Federation sent a telegram to President Bruce saying that they've raised the money. What bank does he want the funds wired to? And that the ship, that they're sending a copy of this telegram to the captain, and the ship's turning around and they're heading back to Havana. Well, when the captain heard this, he was happy as a lark, because now he was going to go back to Havana, unload the passengers, take the ship back to Hamburg, and start his retirement, because this was his last cruise before he retired. And he didn't want anything to jeopardize his retirement. So he starts back for Havana, and halfway back to Havana, he gets a telegram from the president of Cuba saying, the deal is off the table, it's too late, I don't want the money, I don't want the passengers, I don't want to see the St. Louis. If you try to enter the harbor, my Navy will stop you, so be on your way, and I don't want to see you again. Well, this is all the Nazis had to hear, because this is played right up their alley as far as their propaganda was concerned. So now Hitler turns around and says to the owners of the St. Louis, the Hamburg America line, we want you to call the ship back. Whatever excuse you use, we don't care. So the Hamburg America line wires Captain Schroeder saying, bring the ship back to Hamburg. We have to get it ready for the fall cruise, for the winter cruise season. Well, the captain, as I said, doesn't want to do anything to jeopardize his retirement, and he has to obey his bosses. So he turns the ship eastward and starts heading back to Europe. And now, of course, bedlam breaks out on the ship when the people find out the ship is heading back towards Europe. And a mutiny starts, and people want to know about that. They can read the book. I don't want to waste a lot of time on the film. But he manages to quell the mutiny because he has a plan. And he tells the mutineers about the plan, and he says, as a gentleman and a Christian, I promise you that no one of these people will be not one of these people will be returned to Germany. And he has a plan, and he discussed it with the head of his passenger committee, who said, how many people know about this plan? He said, you and I and my first mate. And he says, well, no one else should know about it, because this plan has to look like an accident. Otherwise, nobody will believe it, and these people will not be saved. Okay, enough said. Anyhow, they relented. Captain took his ship back, and they keep going east. Now, in the meantime, there are frantic efforts, diplomatic efforts being pursued by the highest, the Joint Distribution Committee, some of the other Jewish agencies, with all the capitals in Europe, to see if they can't get them to take some of these people so they don't have to be returned to Germany. Well, about the 11th hour, just about the time that the captain's ready to put his plan into action, the Queen of Holland says, Holland will take the 181 passengers with infants. Remember I said my brother's birth is important, and here it is. He's only a year old. He's an infant. Now, my dad has no idea that this ship is not going back to Europe. I mean, Germany. Everybody on board thinks they're going back to Germany. Well, suddenly the Queen of Holland says, we'll take the 181 passengers with infants. My dad says, we got an infant. So we're among the 181 people for Holland because we have a 1-year-old. Now, Belgium says, well, we'll take 200 and whatever it was, 224 or something like that. Then France says, we'll take 280. But we want the 280 with the highest quota numbers, because that way they'll get rid of them first, see, for the United States. And then England magnanimously says, we'll take what's left. You see, England wanted to wait, I guess, because they figure that way, if they take what's left, they'll get the smallest number. They ended up with 288. If they would have started first, everybody would have wanted to go to England.
Sure.
Because everybody had a relative in England, including my mother had an aunt in England. Had they known England was going to take somebody, they'd all wanted to go to England. So as it turned out, we ended up going to Holland. And they put us into a internment camp in Holland, very similar to what the Japanese Americans were put into here during World War II. It was a chain link enclosure. I don't know if there was barbed wire on top, but it was a way for the Dutch to control those 900 people so they would not enter the Dutch workforce. Same concern the Cubans had. If you went in and out of the camp as an adult, you had to have a pass to make sure when you went out that you came back. They didn't want people going into the workforce taking jobs away from the Dutch. Sure. Because this depression was worldwide. And so consequently, we ended up in Holland with $9, let's see, 4 and 4 is 8, $9.40 between, for the whole family. And so I tell a couple of stories when I'm talking to the kids because I try to get them to identify with me as a little old 6.5-year-old in this camp. And what I tell them is, I said, you know, the parents had all the concerns. They had all the worries. They knew what was going on. We kids, we were shielded. We didn't worry about what's going on because we looked for other kids our age. We played. And a good example of that was not too far away from the camp. Now, the camp was guarded by Dutch policemen. I don't know, they weren't soldiers, they were just policemen, and they had German shepherds. And kids like animals, so you make friends with the guards, and then you start playing with their dogs, petting their dogs, and pretty soon you get to be friends. Well, not too far from this gate, there was a railroad siding. I would say maybe a block and a half away at the most. And there was a steam engine there. And kids like, especially boys, like trains. So we want to go over and watch the train. And the guard said, well, if your parents say it's okay. So my mom says, well, as long as the guard can see you, it's all right. But you make sure you're within his eyesight. Okay, so 3 of us boys, myself and 2 others, went over and watched what was going on. And there was a lorry, a truck with a canvas back, backed up to a boxcar. The engine was gone. It had dropped the boxcar off. And the boxcar doors were open, and between the back of the lorry and the boxcar, there was a steel ramp. And there were workmen carrying stuff from unloading the boxcar into the truck. And they were carrying stalks of bananas on their shoulder. And they were walking back and forth. And we were standing alongside the steel ramp. And every once in a while, one of these bananas would drop off. And it hit that steel ramp and bounce on the ground. And I'd grab it, and I'd put it next to me. And I'd tell these other 2 guys, grab them, they're good to eat. So they'd grab them. So these guys, they looked at us, and they knew that we were probably from that camp over there. And so they kind of felt sorry for us. So they gave each one of us a burlap sack. And when I talk to the kids in this classroom, I have a burlap sack hanging at the desk. So that most of them have never seen a burlap sack. So I have this burlap sack, and I show them a burlap sack, and I say, we each got one of these. So now when the bananas fell off, we could put them in a burlap sack. Each one of us got a burlap sack, and these workmen were very nice because now a lot more bananas started falling off. And we each one got them. And you have to remember, and I have a banana there, and it's green. And it's very hard to find a green banana in Arizona. To make my point, I have to show them a green banana, because that's how they ship bananas. They're green.